From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. It is a crime that continues to change and shape our justice system. It's been 36 years since Christine Jessop, a 9-year-old girl, was abducted from her Queensville, Ontario home. There were huge searches of the area by volunteers, and her tortured and sexually assaulted body was discovered in a wooded area on New Year's Eve 1984. The police investigated and charged a man, Gay Paul Moran, but that set many precedents because it was one of the highest profile wrongful convictions in this country's history. The Jessop murder and subsequent trials were also landmarks because of the use of DNA evidence to exonerate Moran. It is even more fitting that the most recent development in this case involves a new form of genetic investigation technique that could help solve other cold cases. Alyshah Hasham is a reporter with the Courts, Crime and Justice team at The Star. She joins us today to talk about the blockbuster development in the Christine Jessop cold case and the potential ramifications. Alyshah, thank you so much for once again joining us on This Matters.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with yesterday's news. The police announced a new suspect in the 35-year-old cold case of Christine Jessop. Let's talk about what happened and what the significance was of yesterday's announcement.
Yeah, it was a huge announcement, more than 3 decades in the making. Police announced that they had essentially found the killer, the person whose DNA was found on Christine Jessop's underwear and a semen sample.
We positively confirmed the identification of the person responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear, Calvin Hoover of Toronto, Ontario.
And the man has since died by suicide, but it seems, at least the police are very confident, that they have found finally the person responsible for this crime that really seized the attention of the city and the country really for the past several years.
So the gentleman's name is Calvin Hoover, and this is one of those things, like, first off, what do we know about him right now? And do we call him the killer? Normally this is one of those things we're very careful about the accused and the suspect, but the police seemed very, very definitive about this.
Right. So it is an unusual situation, although this is something that does come up in cold cases, especially where new kind of techniques or technology and DNA sort of provide these kind of new leads really many, many years after the crime took place. So police seem very, very confident, as you say, that Calvin Hoover had a match to this DNA that was found on Christine Jessop's body. That's always been believed to be the DNA of the person who killed her. It's a very clear match. But since obviously he died in 2015, there's still a lot more investigative work that's going to be done now to try and find out a little bit more about him, about his life, and about what happened around the time of the murder in 1984. And so police have asked people to come forward. They've shared a photograph of Calvin Hoover, and they've really essentially asked for any information about him that the public can provide. And they're going to be continuing this investigation, and I'm not sure how long it's going to take. There are lots of questions that people still have, including whether or not there are other victims or other cases that might be linked to this that hadn't been connected before. All of these are avenues that are going to be explored.
Can you tell us a little bit about Hoover?
We don't know too much about him at this point. He has family in Toronto. He's from the area. He has what police described as a dated criminal record. Kenny Jessop, in an interview with my colleague Jeremy Grimaldi, recalled him as a close family friend of the family, someone who they went to barbecues at each other's houses, shared birthdays together, their kids played together. Hoover's wife worked as a receptionist with Bob Jessop, Christine Jessop's dad, and was friends with Janet Jessop, Christine Jessop's mom. And Kenny Jessop believes that this all finally really makes sense. It really clicked together for him upon hearing that name when police came to him with the news. He said that Hoover might have been one of the very few people who knew that Christine would be home alone that evening because he and his mother were going to be out of town visiting their father. And very few people knew that piece of information. And he said he's always suspected it was someone who had that kind of inside knowledge. that was able to sort of take advantage of that piece of information.
It's an amazing story, an amazing break in this case. Now, this is all due to police technology that they're calling genetic genealogy. Can you tell us a little bit, what is genetic genealogy and how did it help break this case?
Right. It's a really interesting sort of newish type of technique that I think came to public prominence and came to the attention of Toronto police a couple of years ago when the Golden State Killer was caught through this. And so essentially what happens is, or what happened in this case was last year, Toronto police connected with a lab in the US that was able to, from this semen sample that they had, and using sort of what we're told are sort of new techniques to sort of take kind of these older samples of DNA that may not be as usable and basically find a way to use that sample to produce a list of distant relatives or relatives, people who might have some connection to the DNA. So uncles or cousins or very, very distant relatives. And police took that information, essentially ran the DNA through a database called GED Match, where regular people submit their DNA, and it's specifically for use by law enforcement. So unlike sort of some of the other kinds of ancestry type sites, you've specifically opted in to allow law enforcement to use your DNA in this way. And it's often used to sort of identify, unknown remains, as well as solve crimes in the way that this has happened. So yeah, police ran it through this database and they got basically a family tree, kind of a list of names, and they cross-referenced those names against the investigation. And Hoover's name popped up. He was someone who was sort of a neighbor, right? And he had been listed in the initial investigation as someone who might have had access to Christine. And because he had died in 2015, the Center for Forensic Sciences happened to have blood samples of his stored. And so police were able to get a warrant and ask for his DNA to be tested against the sample and a match. It's sort of an extraordinary series of events. Kenny Jessop's words yesterday were, it was a miracle.
When you talk about that, it's one of those things. I remember all of the CSI shows where like everything happens in 48 hours. And obviously, this is one of those things where the technology absolutely needed to improve, as well as all these people just signing up for things like 23andMe so that there is a database people can search.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that obviously there are a lot of privacy concerns about this kind of thing. And it's quite a significant thing to have your DNA taken by the state and put in a database, right? It's only done in relatively serious crimes so that if you're involved in a future crime, your DNA will be on file. But to have just anybody upload or share, I don't even know what the right term is, to share their DNA so that anyone in your family might ultimately be tagged in a criminal investigation is another matter entirely. And it's a really sort of new kind of area, particularly for Canadian law enforcement. But there is an expectation that we'll see more of it. And the CEO of the lab who did this investigation wouldn't say how many other cases Canadian law enforcement is involved in, but he did say there are some. So, and he expects that there will be more announcements like this.
Well, that's just it. I mean, obviously there are some thorny implications there. And the thing is DNA has played a central role in this case for a really long time. I think we have to talk about Gay Paul Moran. And if people haven't been paying attention, can you tell us who he is and why he's important to this case?
Of course. So Gay Paul Moran was the person that police really zeroed in on as the person they believed who killed Christine Jessop. And he was arrested, charged with the murder, and he was tried twice. I believe he was acquitted after the first trial and convicted after the second trial. Very high profile cases. There was a lot of concern about whether or not he did it. And ultimately, he was exonerated when the DNA evidence, once that technology became available, definitively proved that it wasn't him.
Today's a very good day, thanks to DNA.
So he, was very clear yesterday in his statement sort of saying, he always expected DNA exonerated him and he always believed it would lead to the killer. And it has, but it was really the science that, saved him from this wrongful conviction. And ultimately, it was the science that led police to the person who really did it. But it's really a huge development. And the people I spoke to yesterday, many lawyers have been involved in the case. People who were very close with him as a result of the many, many court battles. I mean, really, his case was a landmark wrongful conviction case. It produced a Coffin inquiry, which highlighted several systemic failures in the justice system and the police investigation that should never have happened that led to this man being wrongfully convicted and this sort of cloud of suspicion hanging over him really until this moment. In some ways, for some people, sort of always believed that he had actually been the one who had done it. For him and for all the people in his life, it's a huge development.
We'll be right back. Am I being cynical if I ask that if the cops could probably use a win right now? I mean, they royally screwed up this case the first time, and there are some high-profile cases out there. And this is one of those ones that actually proves when they say a case is ongoing. I mean, it's 35 years. And now the other thing with this case is still ongoing, right?
Yeah. And, the thing about this, I think that, there won't be a trial, obviously. There are going to be questions we'll never get the answers to, right? Unless it turns out that Hoover kept a diary or something like that. But we're never going to get kind of some of the resolution that you might want to have because he's not here to be held accountable. There won't be the kind of close examination or public examination of the evidence. And so, one of the questions that one might have is whether there's going to be some kind of report or some kind of explanation of what this investigation ultimately turns up, sort of given how public and important this whole case has been. And for so many reasons, it's unclear how much information the public will actually ever see from this now new stage of the investigation.
What do you think the police are looking for? They've asked for public assistance. 35 years in the case. Is there still something out there to find out, really?
Well, it sounds like they're really looking for pretty much anything. And, I spoke to Kirk Macon, former Globe and Mail reporter who wrote a book about this case. And, he pointed out, as others have, that this kind of crime is not usually a one-off, although it also shows that these cases they're often not stranger abductions or stranger-related cases. It's usually someone with some kind of connection to the family, so that wasn't surprising, although this man Hoover wasn't on the initial list of suspects. But yeah, I think a big question is what, if any, other crimes was this guy involved in? Are there any other cold cases that might be solved with kind of this new information? I think there's going to be a lot trying to piece together exactly what happened. So, Kenny Jessop has his theory about how Hoover might have lured Christine to come with him by saying he was taking her to visit her dad, perhaps. He said, she might have run back in to get her recorder because she was so excited to show it to her dad. And that might have been how he persuaded her to go with him. We may never get the answer to that question. That may always remain a theory, but I think police are just really trying to piece together this man's entire life now and are going to really be relying on his family potentially and anyone from the community who can shed some more light onto this.
But with Hoover dead, really, we have no idea what this could lead to, right?
With Calvin Hoover dead, there are obviously questions we will never get answers to, but there are so many different directions that police could take this investigation. So much just really remains to be seen how long it's going to take, but hopefully will be some additional information that will shed some more light on how this happened and also how he was able to evade suspicion for so long.
I think that story that we ran with Kenny Jessop and sort of the TikTok of what might have happened was amazing. Obviously, we have a ton of questions about this technology and what effect it could have, but I think that the relief that this has provided and the answers it provided the family absolutely, I think, make it worth it and make the investigation worth it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, speaking to Kirk, he sort of noted that it was an incredibly difficult process for the family because initially they believed police had found the killer. They went through some incredibly difficult trials where they believed the killer was evading justice. Ultimately, it turns out that Moran was exonerated, so that they didn't have the person who had done this. And this has all taken decades and decades to resolve. And it's, they've often spoken on anniversaries and in many times over the years about how this has been incredibly difficult. And, Kenny Jessop yesterday said that, his mother is, I believe she's 78, and this is the first time that she would be able to go to sleep without praying to find the person who did this to her daughter. And it was unclear whether this kind of development would have even happened in her lifetime. So it is extraordinary that at least she has this piece of information now, that her father has this piece of information now. And, the police were careful to say it's not a sort of a joyful day, really, but it certainly provides some small piece, some small comfort that in the end they'd have more information. Although Kenny Jessop also did say that, there is this deep feeling of betrayal, that it was somebody they knew, somebody they presumably trusted, someone that was a friend. It's one of those things where, yes, they now know who did it, but it's also painful as well in its own way.
I do think we need to talk a little bit more about just how significant this case was from so many perspectives. It changed investigations in terms of tunnel vision and the police. In terms of wrongful convictions, it spurred an inquiry. And now it's helped introduce a new technique, genetic genealogy, which could help break other cold cases. What do you think it is about this case that it just keeps providing more to our system?
Yeah, this case has been instrumental in changing the workings of the justice system. As you say, it changed the way police investigations work in terms of things like tunnel vision, fixating very early on one particular suspect who, in this case seemed sort of weird. And that's one of the reasons that there was so much attention paid to him. It changed the way we use expert evidence. It changed the way we use jailhouse informant evidence. It changes the way we talk about something called demeanor evidence, which involves sort of how someone acted or behaved at the time. It just, the closeness of police with the family, this sort of desire to get justice at any cost. It led to the founding of Innocence Canada, which, has worked to overturn and address wrongful convictions for the past several years. And then there's obviously just the emotional, horrible murder of a young girl that devastated her family, devastated the community, sort of terrified the city. She went missing. They didn't find her body for 3 months. So there's 3 months of searching for her. It has really remained in people's hearts and minds for so long, particularly people in the Toronto area. Yeah, it's really hard to overstate how important this case has been to the justice system and to the community. And, to have this kind of development come out of sort of nowhere. It was only just months ago, there was another look, people have revisited the case and there had been no developments. So yeah, it's quite extraordinary.
Well, I'm sure we're going to be following your stories on this and potentially talking to you again. I do think it's fascinating. I want to thank you so much for joining us. But is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know? Is there something that you're going to try and follow next in this story?
Yeah, I think that really the next thing is, just as the police will be doing, trying to find out as much as we can about Calvin Hoover, who he was, and hopefully that's something that we'll be able to provide more information on in the coming weeks.
Well, Alyshah, I want to thank you for your great work and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Alyshah Hasham is a reporter with the Courts, Crime and Justice team at The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajin Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etizaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.